Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the Wisconsin Veterans Museum for another great book talk. We're going to give everybody just a couple of minutes. I see there's still a few people cycling through the waiting room, trying to get connected here. But while we are waiting for those folks to get connected, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, I want to say thank you for joining us on this Monday afternoon for our book talk event. It's always great to have such a good audience on a Monday afternoon at lunchtime. Also, I'd like to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our virtual programming that we get to put on. Not only our book talks, but our drink and draw events, our movie discussion nights, our trivia events, all the great virtual events that we put on here at the museum. I just want to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, and of course, support for the museum, for the foundation coming in memory of Pat Finley. So thank you to the Finley family as well as the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support. I just want to remind everybody that, of course, we have all of our security features enabled today, so nobody will be able to unmute themselves or start their video. So if you have any questions for our author today as we're going through the presentation, please submit them via chat to me directly. I will be bringing up all those questions in a PowerPoint at the end of the program, so the author and our entire audience can see the questions as well as hear them. So please use the chat function and submit any questions directly to me. Today, our author is Dr. David Fitzgerald, joining us from Cork, Ireland. Dr. Fitzgerald is a lecturer in history, of course, at the University of College of Cork in Ireland, and having previously held doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships at the New York University and at the College of Dublin in Ireland as well. He's published numerous works on counterinsurgency and military intervention, and his current research focuses on relations between the U.S. Army and the broader American society. Dr. Fitzgerald, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Eric. And just to say, this is a lovely opportunity to finally get a chance to talk about my book. I was explaining to Eric before I came on that the book's about a year old, and when it came out, it was priced at an obscenely high hardback price of $100+. So it's going to come out in a couple of weeks in paperback, which is going to be $20 odd. So I kind of don't feel guilty telling people of the book and hoping that they buy it, because I can stand over that in good conscience. So the book is a bit of a strange.
Dr. Fitzgerald, do you want to mention the title of your book, please?
Yeah, sorry. It was my PowerPoint. Is my PowerPoint not up yet? No. Okay.
No, not yet.
Right. Okay. Let me just give it. Sorry, Zoom did give permission for that. Okay. The book is Militarization in the American Century. War of the United States and the World since 1941. And I think my PowerPoint's not coming up, but that's absolutely fine. I've got my notes here and it's not too exciting. But the book is, I think, it's not a monograph, right? So it's not an academic argument. It's an attempt to really offer an overview of how important militarization is in American history. I actually was approached by the editors of Bloomsbury a couple of years ago, and they asked me, like, well, we've got this new series on new approaches to international history, and we're asking authors to think of different parts of international history that could do with sort of an authoritative overview, and what would you be interested in doing? And I said straight away, well, we need to think of militarization, because I'm someone who, my work straddles it's kind of between the fields of military history and diplomatic history, and I attend conferences in both subfields, and I kind of find sometimes that those conversations are taking place in parallel. And part of the objective of the book was to make the case that those conversations should be sort of shared conversations. So there's basically three major arguments in the book. And the first is really that you can't understand American history without understanding the centrality of war and the preparation for war. That you can look at any aspect of American social or cultural history, particularly since 1941, anything to do with citizenship, the welfare state, gender, politics, you name it, and you will find militarization is part of that. So that's one part of the argument. And the second part of the argument, though, is to say that when some of my colleagues write about militarism and militarization, there can be this tendency to write about militarization as if it's this really big, monolithic, structural process that is sort of, you know, this overwhelming thing that can't be stopped. Whereas what I'm trying to show by looking at the details of militarization is that it really is a contingent process, right? It's something that there were different paths it could have went down, and there were moments of rupture where things were up in the air, and things could have changed to an extent. So as you'll have gathered from those 2 points, it's a broad argument, and it gets broader in the sense that another objective of the book is to show this history is global. So one of the things the book does is it looks at the experiences of service members overseas, either in war or in peacetime. It looks at flows of refugees and war brides. It looks at the empire of American military bases around the world. So it basically argues that the history of American foreign relations and America in the world can't be done without reference to the military. So as I said, it's a very big argument, and it's an introductory book in a sense. And the idea really is, unlike my other works, it's not a work based on close, detailed archival work. It's really a work where I stand on the shoulders of other historians and try and synthesize this all together and tell a story about American history that is fairly big and fairly broad. But the idea is to introduce people to these ideas about the centrality of militarization. There are 6 different chapters in the book. It's broadly thematic. The first chapter really argues that prior to 1941, militarization wasn't a hugely central fact of American life. I mean, we can, go on. I won't give you a whistle-stop tour of the 19th century here, the 18th century, but of course, the United States is founded on anti-militarism and on the notion that a standing army is a very dangerous thing. And I argue that broadly holds true to about 1941. And then the subsequent 5 chapters, I look at the growth of the concept of national security, which I'll talk about today, and then in different chapters look at sort of militarized spaces, both in the United States and overseas, look at armed encounters with foreigners abroad, look at militarization and citizenship, how American citizenship is tied up with military service, talking about the draft, the old volunteer force, and the last chapter, which I found really fun to write, is a war in American culture. And we can, talk about the Q&A about Tom Clancy novels and how important they are in American culture. But what I thought I would do today is, rather than kind of give you the whistle-stop tour of the whole book, because it is very broad and it could end up being very vague, is I thought what I would do is I would dial in a specific moment and talk about the beginnings of the national security state in the 1940s, and sort of argue that this is a really important moment of rupture. Because as I said, my argument is, if you look at the longer stretch of American history, plenty of wars, plenty of conquest, not that the military has not been an important part of the history, but that it wasn't absolutely central to the functioning of the state and the way it became after World War II. So what I'm going to do for the next little while is I'm going to zoom in on the 1940s in particular, and then talk through the growth of the military, of the national security state. So if you want a clear illustration of just how radically that American consensus on what was needed to keep the US safe changed in the early 1940s, we only need to look at real estate developments in Washington, D.C. So in the summer of 1939, the War and State Departments were both housed in the old Executive Office Building, which is now the Eisenhower Building, which is right next to the White House. By the late 1940s, the new Department of Defense, which incorporated the former War and Navy departments, as well as the new Department of the Air Force, that was now housed across the river in, of course, the Pentagon, which is then and now the world's largest office building. And then in a move symbolic of their diminished importance, the State Department actually shifted 5 blocks west from the White House to Foggy Bottom, where it took up residence in a new building that was actually originally intended to house the War Department. The War Department at this point had grown too big, even as they built the new headquarters, the War Department became too big for it. And then the former State War Navy building next to the White House became home to various White House offices, including the newly formed National Security Council. So within less than a decade, these departments had spilled out from the cramped corridors of this Gilded Era building next to the White House into large, modernist new offices whose stripped classicist architectural style emulated that of other federal buildings from the New Deal era. So this explosion of office building wasn't the first time in the history of Washington, D.C. that federal agencies had moved quickly to expand their footprint. The old Executive Office Building itself actually had been one of the largest office buildings in the world when it was built in 1888, and the Navy Department had actually long since vacated it and had moved into what were temporary headquarters called Main Navy on the National Mall in 1918. And actually, the site for those headquarters was selected by the then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in August 1939, the Secretary of War moved into the adjoining munitions buildings on the National Mall to escape overcrowding. And there's more what they call tempo buildings sprang up at the National Mall. So basically, during World War I, all the land to the immediate north and south of the reflecting pool between what's now the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, that was taken up by office space, by military office space. The difference is, though, these World War I era buildings, they were designed to be temporary. And the planners responsible for national parks in Washington, D.C. from day one were campaigning to get rid of them from the moment their plans were agreed upon. Now, the final temporary buildings weren't actually demolished in 1970, but if you worked in them, you were very aware of their makeshift nature. They were sweltering in the muggy heat in summer, they're freezing in winter, they leaked rain, they suffer from constant rodent and insect infestations, and they actually had a number of structural defects on the rickety upper floors. By contrast, though, if you look at what the buildings they were building in World War II, there's a couple of temporary buildings in the National Mall, but by and large, the buildings that sprung up there were permanent structures. I think there's something symbolic about that. Now, there was still tension between the sort of the notion of wartime emergency and then visions of the post-war world. And we can see this actually, if we look at the wrangling over the construction of the Pentagon itself, we can see some of these tensions. At an August 1941 press conference, President Roosevelt was asked about the War Department's proposed new building over the Potomac, which was going to be the Pentagon. And he remembered his own role in the controversy over the Tempo buildings in the National Mall. And he sort of expressed some unease about the Pentagon, actually, and what it would do to Potomac waterfront vistas. And Roosevelt said, under the name of emergency, it is proposed to put up a permanent building which will deliberately, indefinitely, for 100 years to come, spoil the plan of the national capital. Quite aside from any question of access to it or where people live, or how you get across the bridge or anything else, I think that I've had a part in spoiling the national parks and beautiful waterfront of the district once, and I don't want to do it again. He also then wondered whether all that floor space would be needed once the emergency ended. And he argued that when the time comes, the army, of course, will cut down tremendously on its employees. Actually, on footage of square feet, the thinking worked out pretty well. This building that is proposed on the other side of the river is actually much larger than we need in Washington. Now, despite FDR's doubts and the strong opposition of influential New Dealers such as Harold Ickes, the project had already been authorized by Congress by the time he aired his grievances and it went ahead, albeit it was moved slightly south to a new and less unsightly location chosen by FDR personally in Arlington, Virginia. And actually, in a nod to FDR's hopes for a rapid post-war demobilization, the building's architects actually designed it to withstand very heavy floor loads, so that it could be used actually not so much as an office building, but as a records management facility after the war, when the War Department was supposed to move back across the river to be under the closer supervision from the White House in what is now the State Department buildings. Now, as we know, the Pentagon never did become an archives building. Even as it was constructed at breakneck speed over 16 months, FDR was proved wrong because it was redesigned midway through to provide 50% more office space to accommodate the ever-growing War Department. The basement was originally for storage. That was fitted out with light and heat, and planners added a 5th floor to the inner rings so late in construction that they actually had to tear down some of the roofing that had already been laid over the 4th floor. So the completed building had a population of 33,000 when it was completed in 1943, which wasn't too far off Arlington's 1940 census population of 57,000. The building also included the world's largest telephone exchange with 125 switchboard positions and 6 enormous cafeterias that could seat 1,100 people at one sitting. It also had double the number of restrooms, as the design team led by Colonel Leslie Groves, who of course soon would go on to oversee the Manhattan Project, accommodated Virginia's Jim Crow laws and provided for racially segregated toilet facilities. Even at its post-war low point, the building's working population was still at 23,000. And the Navy then, during that low point, were forced to vacate their premises in the National Mall and join their Army colleagues in the Pentagon after the passage of the 1947 National Security Act, when that created the National Military Establishment and the beginnings of a unified command structure for the military. So the history of the Pentagon and the State Department's buildings at Foggy Bottom, I think, indicate just how important issues of war and peace became to the federal government from the early 1940s onwards. The building boom was symbolic of where the federal dollars were going. Defense-related spending peaked at over 90% of the overall federal budget in 1945. And after a brief post-war lull, it shot back up to 70% in 1953 before slowly drifting down as Cold War tensions gradually eased. Now, to help direct the spending, a series of presidential administrations constructed an entirely new foreign policy decision-making architecture centered on the new National Security Council, and they created multiple federal agencies such as the Department of Defense, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Atomic Energy Agency, to manage different aspects of American strategy. Now, scholars have termed this collection of agencies and the laws associated with them, and they've termed it the national security state. Now, while other chapters of the book get into the effects of militarization, the manner in which this phenomenon shapes spaces, identities, imaginations, and encounters with others, this chapter is different in that, what I'm trying to do here is focusing on the political processes that drove the growth of the national security state and made it so central to the federal government in the 1940s and onwards. And so much of American politics, economic policy, and governance became oriented around the needs and the idea of national security, that I think what we need to do is sketch out the origins of the concept and the politics surrounding it. And as Andrew Preston and other scholars have pointed out, the term, which actually originates in the late 1930s, has a much broader meaning than mere military strategy. National security, the idea of national security, was as much about defending values and a way of life as it was about defending territory from attack. Given such a really broad definition, it was inevitable that its reach was incredibly broad and deep. But it's worth recalling, though, that FDR's objections to the construction of the Pentagon, they weren't just about aesthetics. So even though American defense spending has been enormous and the logic of the national security state has informed huge swathes of federal governance, it's not the case that American policymakers saw themselves as embracing a fully military state. In keeping with the patterns of previous American wars, FDR assumed that the military would drastically shrink in size after World War II. And the presidents most responsible for the construction of the national security state, that's Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower, they were both wary of the growth in military spending. Both Democrats and Republicans feared the emergence of what they termed a garrison state, and anti-statist impulses actually informed many of the congressional debates on military budgets and legislation governing these new agencies and structures. And on the other hand, as the historian Gary Gerstle points out, advocates of various initiatives, including groups as diverse as university administrators, infrastructure planners, and climate activists, have all invoked the term national security as a way to gain policy tractions for their projects, even if these programs only had a very tenuous connection to issues of war and peace. So these conflicting impulses, to resist the growth of the state, lest the state fundamentally endanger American democracy, and also to use concerns about security to address societal deficits. They illustrate that the American national security state was a peculiar construction. It was immensely powerful, but at the same time, it was frequently worried about its own vulnerability. Its existence was far from inevitable, and in its mature form was very much contingent on the particular circumstances from which it emerged. The sociologist Charles Tilly has a very famous phrase that war made the state and the state made war. And that gives us a good sense of why the national security state took the form it did. If war makes the state, then the ambiguous character of the Cold War, which blurred the lines between war and peace and raised the stakes of war to existential levels due to the threat of nuclear war, that informed the particular path that the national security state took as it matured in the 1940s and 1950s. Equally, Americans who thought that such a state did not fit within the American political tradition, they also had an influence on this trajectory. And activists who opposed the different ways in which the American state oriented itself towards the preparation for war did not understand the state of affairs to be preordained. So as I mentioned, several scholars have argued that the current meaning of the term national security is quite a recent development. So Andrew Preston notes that presidents rarely, if ever, used the term national security prior to the Great Depression. And after 1931, it began to appear in speeches and pamphlets, but only in reference to economic insecurity. Now, the New Deal aimed to protect individual citizens from the wild fluctuations of the economy. And in this sense, the search for national security originally was a policy response to an economic crisis. Now, the Roosevelt administration's thinking on economic security, though, couldn't be divorced from its views on the threat posed by hostile powers across the ocean. And over the course of the 1930s, and influenced in part by hawkish intellectuals like Edward Meade Earle, FDR began to use the term national security to refer to military affairs as well. Now, Preston argues this new definition of security was a significant departure because until FDR, no American statesman had presented security as having two equal parts: physical and normative, territorial and ideological, forming an integrated, indivisible whole. Now, by Preston's count, FDR used the term more times between 1938 and 1941 than all previous presidents had in the history of the United States. This shift, Preston argues, was driven by the disappearance of what the historian C. Vann Woodward has called free security. And that's the sense that the United States was physically protected by two oceans and weak neighbors to the north and south. The specter of a German-dominated Europe and a British Empire shattered by the Axis powers meant that the oceans would no longer afford protection to the United States, either from bomber fleets or from saboteurs who might already be present on American soil. More importantly, the US would be cut off from world markets and would struggle to maintain economic growth in such a world. National security then became a way of thinking where the boundaries between the foreign and domestic, peace and war blurred. Its primary goal was to protect citizens from insecurity of all kinds, whether that be economic or military, and New Deal policymakers increasingly oriented towards threats from the outside. The historian Melvin Leffler, he describes national security as encompassing, quote, the decisions and actions deemed imperative to protect domestic core values from external threats. And in the late 1930s, events overseas seemed to directly threaten American core values for the first time, rather than just American interests or power. So to many Americans, this crisis seemed existential. Now, to FDR and other internationalists, it was obvious that the US was newly vulnerable particularly after the fall of France. And in order to defend American values and the American way of life, the US would have to actively shape the world around it. As historian Stephen Wertheim has documented, foreign policy elites cohered in 1940 and early 1941 around the idea that the US would need to pursue global military superiority in order to protect its place in the world. The post-war order would have to be underwritten by American military power. Reflecting on this new disposition in his fourth inaugural address in January 1945, at a time when he was really preoccupied with thinking about the shape of the post-war world, Roosevelt declared, "We have learned that we cannot live alone at peace, that our own well-being is dependent on the well-beings of other nations far away." Now, the historian Elizabeth Borgwat, she's termed this outlook as a New Deal for the world, where New Deal planners hope to offer large-scale institutional solutions to global problems in order to protect the American way of life and to expand the New Deal's benefits to the whole world. So it's a very, as you can see, very ambitious vision of world order. Now, this view wasn't necessarily a common one in the late 1930s. Even if it was by 1945. In the late 1930s, Americans looked on with fear both the continuing economic turmoil and the rise of dictatorships around the world, which to some seemed to offer the key to the future that liberal capitalist democracy couldn't provide. In the shadow of the 1930s, a great debate over whether or not the US should intervene in the coming war roiled American society. And both sides of the debate actually, by 1940, both sides of the debate actually actively supported military rearmament. And even those who opposed the administration's inclination to either directly or indirectly intervene in the war against the Axis thought that the US would need to be able to defend the continental United States from invasion. But obviously they diverged greatly on whether or not national security required active military intervention overseas. And in order to make his case, Roosevelt had to make it clear to Americans just how vulnerable they really were. Now, this is hardly the first time that Americans felt a sense of vulnerability, but it was much more acute in his era. And it's a shame that I didn't manage to get my slides up, because cartographers and magazine publishers in this era, they played a hugely important role by publishing maps which showed the US at the center of the world and besieged on all sides by Axis powers. Publishers showed the growing Axis control over vast swathes of territories, and readers could thus draw their own conclusions how easily these powers could end up surrounding the US, cutting it off from the rest of the world. And funnily enough, the popularity of things like globes, and Roosevelt had a huge 750-pound globe in his office, they allowed advocates for intervention to demonstrate just how quickly enemy bombers could cross the oceans and reach American cities, which at that point lay completely unprotected. The lessons of the war were that time and space were collapsing. And you could see this collapsing time and space through the rapid success of the German blitzkrieg in Poland, and of course the blitzkrieg in France, that the time seemed to collapse so quickly. And in the May 1941 fireside chat, FDR warned that some people think that we are not attacked until bombs actually drop in the streets of New York or San Francisco or New Orleans or Chicago. But they're simply shutting their eyes to the lesson that we must learn from the fate of every nation the Nazis have conquered. The irony was, though, that in playing up this sense of insecurity in the name of national security, Roosevelt was leaving the door open to some of the very threats to domestic core values that he sought to ward off. For many internationalists, the strongest argument for taking up arms against the Axis was not that Germany or Japan could ever realistically threaten US territory. It was that a world dominated by those powers would necessitate that the United States permanently mobilize for war in order to defend itself, producing a garrison state dominated by military men, thus fatally undermining the American way of life. They argued that it would be far better to defeat these powers in concert with other nations, rather than wait to confront them alone in a long and difficult standoff. The challenge then would be to pursue a form of national security policy that could challenge militarism overseas without promoting it at home. Now, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and on the Philippines in December 41 obviously formally brought the US into the war, and it made plain the need to overhaul intelligence structures to ensure better coordination between military services and civilian decision makers. But wartime requirements also made economic coordination vital. And so the FDR administration worked to establish new federal agencies to oversee the war effort and to plan and manage the wartime economy. Agencies such as the War Production Board, Office of Price Administration, the Office of War Information, and the Office of Scientific Research and Development all sought to mobilize and coordinate the whole of American society in a manner reminiscent of the economic planning of the early years of the New Deal. Now, while these agencies worked to ensure that the economy was producing enough material to supply both the United States and its allies, the military embarked on a massive mobilization, which meant that over 12 million personnel were serving in uniform by 1945, along with 2.6 million civilians working in national defense. And that's at a total federal civilian workforce of 3.4 million. So you can get the sense of the scale of the military state. Now, in spite of the immense scope of their responsibilities, coordination amongst these agencies was actually quite haphazard, and their efficacy really depended more on the personalities of the people running them than any deeper institutional competence. And they were actually looked upon with suspicion by both Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats. So at the end of the war, these particular agencies, these economic agencies, were rapidly dismantled. And similarly, the military began to work to demobilize quickly as soon as Japan was defeated too, although it was clear to even the most optimistic of planners that its strength would remain far above that of the pre-1940s armed forces. But despite this demobilization, World War II differed from previous major wars. Firstly, in that it said intellectuals had, by 1940 and 41, grasped the necessity of American military primacy, but also, of course, crucially, the World War II was followed by the Cold War, which meant that this bout of wartime state building took on a permanent character. So just a few years after the US began a tentative demobilization, lawmakers were contemplating new institutions which would preserve and extend American military hegemony in competition with the Soviet Union. So if the early New Deal produced an alphabet soup of new agencies to deal with the economic emergency, then the early Cold War resulted in a profusion of what scholars call three-letter agencies, as the Truman administration established in very quick succession: the Atomic Energy Commission, 1946, the National Security Council, the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Military Establishment in 1947, the Department of Defense, which replaced the National Military Establishment in 1949, and then finally the National Security Agency, or NSA, founded in 1952. So there's a huge burst of state making happens in these years. And this flurry of institution building constituted a decisive break with the past, as in this moment power flowed from the legislative branch towards the executive. Some of this was due to fears that nuclear war would require rapid decision-making, something that was not always one of Congress's strengths. I think true then and probably true now. Consequently, congressional leaders had no seat on the National Security Council, which was designed to coordinate national security policy across the federal government. And many of these agencies also prioritize secrecy. So for instance, the Atomic Energy Commission, which was established to make permanent the Manhattan Project's nuclear weapons research and manufacturing, this operated with minimal congressional oversight and was exempted from the civil service system, even as the huge scale of the agency meant that its facilities actually occupied more land than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. Now, the US had just fought a totalitarian power in Nazi Germany, and its leaders believed it was confronting another one in the Soviet Union. And it was a reality that the creators of these agencies were only too aware of. Liberal and libertarian thinkers, such as Hannah Arendt, Friedrich Hayek, and Harold Laswell, they warned against the massive concentration of power in the hands of the state. And it was really Laswell's concept of the garrison state that stuck and informed public and elite debates about the construction of the national security state. And President Harry S. Truman, who really is one of the key architects of the state, he was actually a reluctant architect of the national security state. On the one hand, he had wartime experience with the Senate Armed Services Committee, and that gave him a really keen understanding of the extent of duplication and waste present in the armed forces. And he had an enduring suspicion of military cliques, which is a feeling made much stronger by witnessing the endless and vicious inter-service and squabbling between the Army and Navy during the war. And he believed that the service secretaries were effectively hostages of their respective branches of the military. And along with Secretary of State and obviously former Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, he pushed for a unified military establishment and a Secretary of Defense who would be directly accountable to the President. On the other hand, as a New Dealer, he was very reluctant to permanently divert resources away from social programs and into the defense budget. On the other end of the political spectrum, Republicans led by Senator Robert Taft were very suspicious of an overly centralized command structure, preferring sort of a liberal Republican diffusion of power that maintained a strong voice for each of the services. So to that end, they were actually very supportive of the ultimately unsuccessful efforts of the Navy to promote a much more loose system of coordination, cooperation amongst the services rather than a centralized Joint Chiefs. Taft was also much more reluctant to embrace a global role for the US, and he opposed Truman on things like foreign aid, which had ramped up sharply in the aftermath of the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and its extensive commitments to alliances and economic and military aid. Taft rejected proposals for a large standing army, and he really thought the US could protect itself by massively expanding the new Air Force and equipping it with atomic weapons, preferring to emphasize hemispheric defense over global containment. Now, while Truman wanted to contain the defense budget in order to further expand the New Deal, Taft worried about deficits. He proposed to cut Social Security to provide for any increase in defense spending, and he preferred to generally shrink the federal budget in order to cut the state down to size. Neither Truman nor Taft were wholly in favor of what the historian Michael Hogan has called national security ideology, and both felt some unease, actually, as the defense budget climbed steadily upwards in spite of bipartisan fears of the garrison state. Others within the foreign policy establishment, though, thought that the threat from the Soviet Union was serious enough to make any quibbling over budgets or limits to defense spending unnecessary. This group included Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who replaced the more cautious Marshall in January 1949. They thought that the Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons and its military capabilities posed an existential threat. This viewpoint found its purest expression in the famous policy paper, United States Objectives and Programs for National Security, commissioned by President Truman in January 1950. This is a 70-page report authored by a hawkish team led by the State Department's Policy Planning Unit, and it was submitted to the National Security Council and given the title, the identifier of NSC 68 in April of that year. This report adopted a really apocalyptic tone. It claimed that the issues that face us are momentous, involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic, but of civilization itself. And the report argued that budgetary considerations will need to be subordinated to the stark fact that our very independence as a nation may be at stake. It called for a rapid buildup of military strength, including both nuclear and conventional forces, along with increased military aid to allies overseas, and investment in public diplomacy, propaganda, and covert operations. To fund this, it proposed increasing taxes and reducing spending on non-defense related programs. The authors of NSC 68 believe, though, that such a massive military buildup need not have a negative effect on the standard of living. And this is, I think, the interesting part of the argument. They argue that the economic effects of the program might be to increase the gross national product by more than the amount being absorbed for additional military and foreign assistance. And the idea was the deficit fuel spending would provide fiscal stimulus to the economy to the point where economic growth would offset the need for new taxes or spending cuts elsewhere. Now, NSC 68, which is a really foundational document of the national security state, it initially received a very frosty reception from President Truman. He had invested in containment in Europe because he believed that that was a cost-effective way to prevent the Soviet Union's influence from expanding while avoiding a larger military buildup. But the surprise news of North Korean forces crossing the 38th parallel and launching an invasion of South Korea in June 1950 completely changed the character of the discussion within the administration. So by September 1950, Truman ordered that NSC 68 be understood as a statement of policy to be followed over the next 4 or 5 years. And those instructions fundamentally changed the character of the Cold War, making it an ideologically charged global campaign that became much more militarized. The defense budget increased nearly sixfold between 1948 and 53. So it goes from a budget of $9 billion in 1948 to $53 billion in 1953. Now, an American public that had been watching the government demobilize its large military and unwind its wartime institutions suddenly found that preparation for war formed a much greater part of their daily lives. And this is not quite the garrison state that Laswell and others had feared, but the quest for national security now involved a substantially greater defense budget than had ever before been approved in peacetime, and a federal state that assumed increased responsibility for larger and larger swathes of American life. Speaking to an audience of newspaper editors in April 1953, just a few weeks into his first term in office, President Dwight D. Eisenhower echoed many of the fears of an overly large defense budget that had haunted both Truman and Taft. He described the Cold War as, quote, a life of perpetual fear and tension, a burden of arms draining the wealth and labor of all peoples. He quantified the trade-off between arms manufacturing and economic welfare in explicit terms, noting how much housing the money used to build a single destroyer could have paid for, or how many schools could have been constructed for the price of a heavy bomber. He argued that, quote, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. And he claimed that under the cloud of threatening war, humanity is hanging from a cross of iron. And he repeated these concerns again in his farewell address of January 1961, and what's probably the best known speech of the genre, his farewell address. He cautioned that the influence of the military establishment in the arms industry is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government, and he worried about its grave implications for liberty and democracy. And he gave this really stark warning that in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Now, what's really striking with those two speeches, I mean, one is, I suppose, how stark they are in their warning, but even though they were delivered 8 years apart, their similarity is really striking too. And what's noteworthy is those 8 years constituted the entirety of Eisenhower's presidency. And yet he, just like Truman before him, presided over a deepening of Cold War tensions and expansion of the national security state, even as he openly and publicly expressed his doubts about aspects of the project. Eisenhower's New Look policy had attempted to rein in defense spending by relying extensively on nuclear weapons at the expense of conventional forces, and the defense budget did drop below its post-NSC 68 peak, but it remained well above the level seen from 1946 to 1952. So why did Eisenhower, who's a popular two-term president with more military experience than pretty much any other occupant of the White House, fail to arrest the expansion of the national security state and the military-industrial complex? Now, geopolitics certainly played a role, much as it did with the success of NSC 68. But what's noteworthy about Eisenhower's tenure is how the Cold War and its associated militarization took on a domestic political momentum of its own. So when I talk about domestic momentum, part of what was going on here was that anti-communism was becoming an important factor in shaping electoral politics in such a way that it made it very difficult for political leaders to back out of military commitments. The looming threat of war in the early 1940s had seen Congress pass the Smith Act, which criminalized a wide range of activities by declaring them to be subversion. This is a move is supposed to target communists, anarchists, and fascists. Truman extends this peacetime restriction on civil liberties by signing Executive Order 9835, which is known as the Loyalty Order, which allowed the FBI to examine the backgrounds of all federal employees, all 2 million of them, and investigate any questionable associations or beliefs. And the FBI itself increased in size 7-fold between 1939 and 1953. And the historian Mary Dzidziak argues that what she calls the domestic politics of repression, they were informed but not determined by geopolitical developments. But in either case, this extension of wartime-like restrictions on civil liberties into peacetime enabled a crusading anti-communism that wasn't seen elsewhere in the Western world. Now, the historian Jonathan Bell has claimed that this Cold War atmosphere severely limited American liberals' room for maneuver in electoral politics and prevented the sort of popular front alliances that have powered the New Deal, and it foreclosed the possibility of the pursuit of broader social democratic policies, such as those the British Labour Party implemented after their general election victory in 1945 and built the British welfare state. And instead, these anti-communist impulses pushed New Dealers to embrace a Cold War consensus that required acquiescence to higher defence spending and to expanding the reach of the national security state. Now, while the left was constrained by anti-communism, Republicans were able to use fears of external subversion to their electoral advantage, taking control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1933 in the midterms of 1946, after a campaign where many of their candidates, including Richard Nixon, a very young Richard Nixon, ran on raid-baiting platforms. But the Republican Party found itself constrained in different ways, and in actually very, very long-lasting ways. The Taft wing of the party, these guys were very skeptical of global military commitments, and they were unable to persuade Eisenhower to withdraw from NATO, although he was quite sympathetic to their arguments in some way about military spending. And they found that the ground began to shift under their feet as the political effect of defense spending took hold in electoral politics. The political scientist Aaron Freeberg has said that the national security state that emerged in the US was actually much smaller than it could have been given the external pressures of the Cold War, and the policymakers emphasized private industry over state-owned arsenals and shipyards. And that's broadly true. But this investment in private industry created its own series of institutions and political incentives, many of which would have destructive effects later on. And in the absence of a broader welfare state, military spending allowed the national security state to provide well-paying jobs in the defense industry, and Midwestern anti-intervention Republicans soon lost influence within the party as military Keynesianism, prompted by the Korean War, took hold to great effect. In his really fabulous study of how Cold War defense spending affected American democracy, the historian Michael Brains has argued that military officials, business executives, local politicians, labor leaders, and unemployed factory workers realized that the defense economy's resources could serve their respective ends. The largesse provided by increased defense spending further entrenched anti-communism amongst liberals and made labor unions acquiesce to militarization in the name of providing good middle-class jobs for workers. On the right, domestic welfare programs and infrastructure spending that were couched within the language of militarization became acceptable or even necessary. And this could lead to policymakers using national security as a form of surrogacy. So, for instance, the legislation that authorized the Eisenhower administration's ambitious road building program, which creates the interstate highway system, was known as the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. The security rationale for the highway system was that it would allow for the rapid movement of military units across the country in the event of an invasion, or more likely, for the speedy evacuation of cities that were threatened by atomic attack. But as Gary Gerstle has observed, the actual effect of the act went way beyond military preparedness, as federal funding produced over 40,000 miles of road that completely reorganized the country around this grid of north-south and east-west highways. And similarly, university administrators and scientists used Cold War imperatives to attract funding for research and development via the National Science Foundation, which acted in part to militarize science and higher education, but really in other ways, this grabbing of Cold War funding was just a cover of the expansion of the university system that its advocates desired anyway. So this combination of anti-communism and military Keynesianism had a really powerful effect on electoral politics. Eisenhower's warning of the power of the military-industrial complex, we should see that in the context in which it took place, which is the aftermath of the 1960 presidential election, which Eisenhower just witnessed John F. Kennedy winning a narrow victory against Vice President Richard Nixon. And he did that, of course, by highlighting the supposed missile gap between the US and the Soviet Union. Kennedy, crucially, he campaigned heavily in districts where the defense industry had suffered job losses, and he attracted donations from aerospace contractors. He did very well in industrial regions in the Northeast and the Pacific coast that relied heavily on military spending. More broadly, Kennedy thought that military spending could revive a flagging American economy and do so in such a way that would attract the approval of voters and donors who had previously supported Eisenhower. Now, he reversed course after the Cuban Missile Crisis and commissioned Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to cut wasteful defense spending. But when he did that, he immediately found himself constrained by the politics that he had harnessed during his election. So, for instance, Boeing workers in Washington State were irked by Boeing's loss of the TFX fighter contract. They were rumored in 1963 to be supporting Barry Goldwater, who's going to be Nixon's or Kennedy's probable opponent in 1964. And newspaper columnists were writing in 1963 that such was labor's discontent at the loss of the contract and the closure of shipyards in Washington that the state would probably swing to the Republicans in 1964. Now, we can see after the Vietnam War and the collapse of the Cold War consensus, the resilience of this, so of this state. In 1974, after Watermath, a huge swathe of the lawmakers come into Congress planning to cut the defense budget, and the defense budget did climb down from 46% of the federal budget to 29.5% of the federal budget in 1974. But what happened is local opposition to defense spending cuts actually stymied any attempt to seriously rein in military spending. And then the economic crisis in the 1970s, which saw declining wages, higher unemployment, they meant that defense hawks could argue that higher defense spending was necessary to provide well-paying jobs to American workers. Same logic applies again in the 1990s, when the end of the Cold War makes the case for the dismantling of a large military. Bipartisan resistance cuts means the defense budget only declined moderately, and even before 9/11 changed the picture again, the defense budget had already began to recover from its mid-1990 lows. And finally, if we want to look at how, the last point I would make is, if you want to understand the particular form the national security state took, we should explore, okay, how was this enormous defense expenditure financed? If the military-industrial complex in the Cold War combined to close off the possibility of forging an American social welfare state similar to those built in Western Europe, they also meant that conservatives were completely unable to return to pre-New Deal equilibrium. Wartime spending in World War II was partly financed by widely held Liberty bonds and by a newly enlarged system, but also by a newly enlarged system of mass taxation. The number of wage earners subject to income tax increased tenfold between 1939 and 1945, and individual income tax receipts increased by $892 million between 1940 and 1945. Now, Republicans, when they took Congress in 1946, hoped to enact large-scale tax cuts. Growing Cold War tensions meant that their anti-tax measures fell afoul of the increasing defense budget. And when Eisenhower took office in 1953, he actually worked to defend the federal income tax, which is an unusual stance for Republicans to take at the time. So therefore, the national security state helped usher in a modernized, comprehensive system of mass taxation, one that affected all Americans, which proved very difficult for even its greatest critics to undo. Now, the Republican assault against taxation did have a long-term effect on American finances, even if they were ultimately unsuccessful in their attempts to undo the New Deal. In the early phases of the Korean War, Truman was initially able to raise taxes thanks to a public that just recently experienced mass taxation and Liberty bonds during World War II, only to find that as public support for the war waned, it became much more difficult to raise new taxes. And that experience meant that when President Johnson looked to finance the American war in Vietnam, he was quite wary of raising taxes. So he imposed a war tax just once, which is in 1968. Instead, much of his military spending was paid for by issuing government debt. And the political scientist Sarah Krebs argues that this represents a crucial turning point in the relationship between popular opinion and elite decision-making in war. Krebs characterizes this as a shift from a Liberty bond model of war financing to what she calls a hide-and-seek model. And this strategy has been pursued by pretty much every leader since the war in Vietnam. Moving the fiscal costs of war onto the future meant that the public was no longer burdened by war taxes and thus much less likely to call for an end to war. And of course, importantly, changes in global financial markets in the 1970s and the dollar's hegemony meant that the debt finance war actually was relatively cheap, and the US has never had any trouble selling bonds. The post 9/11 wars, I think, represent the purest form of this model. The Bush administration made sure that a large portion of the costs of the war were off books and were paid for by what was called the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, separate from the Pentagon's regular budget and subject to very little congressional oversight. Now, even if the costs of these wars seem to be invisible, they remain extraordinarily high. In 2019, Brown University's Cost of War project estimated the total cost of the post-9/11 wars to be $6.4 trillion. I checked it as of last year, that's up to $8 trillion now, and that includes $925 billion in interest due on war debt. The financial costs of these wars was scarcely visible to voters and the all-volunteer force. Something I haven't talked about today meant that human costs were unevenly distributed, while jobs provided by defense spending were all too apparent. Now, the invisibility of the costs of intervention, I think, does a lot to explain how the US was able to sustain its military intervention in Afghanistan for nearly 2 decades, despite its evident lack of success. So just to close, and I know this has been a whistle-stop tour, what the book is trying to do, and I've given you a snapshot of that today, is to explain that the process for preparing and mobilizing for war has been enormously consequential both for the United States and its relations with the world. And some political theorists have even argued that the political instability we've seen in the US in the 21st century can partly be attributed to militarization losing its moorings with the end of the Cold War, which meant that American political factions would no longer unify around confronting the political and military threat posed by the Soviet Union. The militarization of the US, however, extended beyond the Cold War. Once the logic of national security took hold in the early 1940s, it became and remained a centrally important priority for the state, both crowding out other imperatives and becoming a necessary reference point for political coalitions that wanted to harness the rhetoric and logic of national security in order to advance their goals. I'll leave it there because there's about 80,000 more words of the book to go, and I think you've probably had enough for one morning. So thanks for your time, and look forward to hearing more.
Dr. Fitzgerald, that was fantastic. I can't wait to read the book. There's so much to unpack there. I love the way you bring social aspects in and connect them. You link them directly to everything that's happened militarily. And we all know that happens. We just don't, I don't think we see it enough as far as research goes. So well done. That was wonderful.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I said, you can buy the book for a cheaper price soon. So it will be available for reading soon.
That's even more attractive right there. We're going to get into some questions. We have a few of them from our audience members. Let me bring up my PowerPoint just briefly. First question, what was the most difficult part about writing a book such as this?
Yeah, it was a really unusual experience, right? Because as mentioned right at the outset, this isn't a typical history book, and that it's, you know, my PhD was based, as all PhDs are, on archival work and digging deep and really mastering a very narrow slice of history, right? This thing involved reading like libraries worth of books to try and get sense of the bigger picture, and that was a real challenge. And I will say, as you know, I don't want to brag, but as someone who's not that seniors and so I'm not that aged, I don't think, maybe, I don't know, at a reasonably early stage of my career at least, it was unusual to sort of have this chance to try and write something big. So in one sense, it was just the sheer volume of reading I needed to do and to be able to, you know, speak authoritatively on something. And then another way, it was strange in that, again, with archival work, you are utterly confident in what you were saying. You know who said what to who on what day, and here's the facts, right? This is much more synthetic interpretive work. So it took me a while, to be honest, to find my voice and to be able to sort of have some confidence in what I was saying, you know, to sort of sketch things out in these really broad brushstrokes and to be reasonably sure that I was right. And doing that involved lots of reading, lots of revision, lots of conversations with friends, but it's a different form of writing. It's been good for me. I've really enjoyed doing it. It's really fun. The one other thing I will say is I in very practical terms, I wrote most of this during the pandemic, and that was a challenge with a 1-year-old and then and then what became a 2-year-old running around the house, and he was a very understanding 2-year-old. But writing a book with a 2-year-old is that's with no childcare, that's a challenge too.
Yeah, that takes a lot of concentration and focus, especially with such a difficult topic, definitely. Do you see a difference between the term militarism and the actual fact of militarization that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, that's a great question, brilliant question. And actually, when I was originally putting together the talk, I was like, well, I'll give them an overview of the whole book, and then I felt it was too broad and vague. And actually, in the introduction of the book, I do talk about the distinction. They are different. So, okay, let me give this a go and see how much I remember from my own book. To me, militarism is about the glorification of the military, right? It is about celebration of the armed forces and of war itself, right? It's so when we think of militarism, we often think about 19th century Prussia. We might think of Nazi Germany. We might think of 1930s Japan. Militarization is different. Militarization, the German historian Michael Geyer's got a great phrase. He says it's the tense and contradictory process through which civil society prepares itself for the organization of violence. And that basically means is the orientation of a society towards preparing for war. And that means militarism is kind of a culture, right? Where you're celebrating the armed forces. Militarization is really about how does society get ready for war, and it's more of a process. Therefore, it's much broader. It goes, you know, so for instance, we might think of civil defense in the 1950s and the organization of society around the you know, bomb shelters and things. That isn't really a glorification of war, I don't think, but it is certainly a way of militarizing society. So I would say militarization, it's a process, it's a verb. Militarism is something which is much more about the celebration of armed forces. And I would say at various points in American history, I think we have seen militarism. I think we can maybe look at certain moments where the military has been celebrated, maybe uncritically in some ways. But I think at core, I think what you see in the US is something different, it's something a bit more complex, which is the idea that all from 1941 onwards, a central function of the state is the preparation for war, and that affects all sorts of things. And it's a deeper phenomenon, I would argue. It's also trickier to get a handle on, I think, in some ways.
That definition of militarization that you put out there, that you quoted, I love the word that the term contradictory is used in there. So many things that we want to do, but it does contradict what we want our society to be and how we want to be as people. And I think that was really important. I think that was fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, and sure. Look, I mean, you know, as I said in the talk, you look at people like Truman and Eisenhower; they're fascinating because they're pouring money into defense, and they're both deeply uncomfortable while they're doing it. I think it's really interesting to look at that moment and look at it with fresh eyes and realize that, yeah, as you said, it's contradictory. There's always these tensions there.
You also talked about. Sorry, no, don't do that. Go back the other way. You talked about the term national security. Would this term be recognizable the way we use it today? Would it be recognizable by those in the 40s, such as Truman, and moving into the 50s with Eisenhower?
So I definitely think it would make no sense to anyone who used the term in the 1930s. I think those guys, the New Dealers of the 1930s, would say this is bizarre, because they meant it in a primary economic sense. I wonder, I think some of the more hawkish people, I'm not sure about Truman, but I think people like Edward Earl Mead, who's a really important figure, and Andrew Preston's written a lot about him. His hawkishness really meant national security was everything. So I think maybe for some of the guys, some of the more hawkish characters in the 40s, certainly by the mid 40s, I think they were embracing a very expansive definition of national security. But that's the rupture point. I think before then, it means something very, very different, and it's something we're not used to today. Thinking in terms of economic security first, that was what they meant, and that's not what we mean now, I think.
Yeah, and certainly, with our global war on terror, certainly that term has evolved and changed. But yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting question to maybe kind of throw back how previous leaders would kind of view this term that was synonymous with the way they were thinking then. Is it true that the size of the U.S. military briefly shrank to as low as around 600,000 during this 1945 to 1950 period?
No, I don't have my charts directly in front of me, but I think that's broadly accurate. So you do see this interesting drawdown, a very rapid drawdown in 1946 to about 1947. I know I can't give you chapter verse the exact sort of number, but you saw what was interesting. My colleague Ruth Lawler, who is at Cornell, is writing an edited collection on a global history of World War II, and she puts a lot of importance on 1945 and 1946 as years where there was very serious demobilization happening. Even though, as I said in the talk, the policy elites really did see global military hegemony is something important, but this demobilization happens very rapidly in a very chaotic way. And what's really important to note, and Ruth always talks about this, it's a bottom-up phenomenon in some ways, in that 1945, 1946, you see mass GI protests in the Philippines and Europe and elsewhere where guys are like, I want to go home, like I'm done, like, you need to take me home now and demobilize me. So you do see a very large drop very quickly, and I think it's a brief drop. And obviously in 1947, you have the National Security Act and the beginnings of the ramp up in defense spending again. But yeah, 1946, you got a much larger military than that of 1939, certainly, but a military that really dropped to a very, very low point for a brief period and then scale up. I think the idea was the Air Force would have been the likes of Taft thought the Air Force could really provide hemispheric defense, and that was what they could rely on for defending the US in the future.
Yeah, I like the way you make that differentiation too between hemispheric defense and actual continental defense or land defense. And I think once again that's just a mindset that we always know is there, but we just don't make that distinction. We I don't know, for whatever reason, or maybe I just don't hear enough about it. But I like the way you did that, make that distinction. I thought that was wonderful. Have the impacts from 9/11 and increased roles of technology changed national security approaches in the U.S., particularly with its alliances and ability to respond to ever-present threats?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, the post 9/11 sort of era is really the second national security era, right? The first one was established in the 1940s and, is maintained roughly until the post 9/11 era, where you do see, this massive increase in intelligence capabilities. That's really, really, really important. In terms of, the Five Eyes, signals intelligence, intercepts, all these are things. And what is interesting, to go back to your point about the question of national security in the 1940s, and the difference is, in some ways, obviously, it's given the US extraordinary capability just to this global, I won't say it's obviously imperfect, but the intelligence is extraordinary what they can see. But also you see a shift towards a threat tolerance that's very, very, very low, right? So if you think about what Truman would have tolerated in the 1940s versus what, say, the Bush administration was willing to tolerate post 9/11, it's a world of a difference. I mean, famously, Vice President Cheney comes up with what's called the 1% doctrine. And that is, if there's 1% chance that terrorists will strike the continental United States, we got to take them out, which leads to very expansive uses, particularly special forces, and very expansive military strikes. And of course, the other part of technology is that, as we all know, famously, the cost of military strikes decreases tremendously when you've got drones and various standoff weapons that can do this for you. And I think that obviously certainly has consequences and lowering the cost of intervention still further. So yeah, I would definitely agree. And there's lots to say about post 2001 and the authorization of these military force and how global that war on terror has been. I mean, it really truly has been global in terms of its footprint.
And then just my own question, kind of piggybacking off of that, do you see anything, that maybe is looking like another switch or another change in the way that we're going to look at national security here shortly, especially when you look at Russia's actions in Ukraine or anything like that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's interesting. On the one hand, right, I mean, I think we're in a really interesting moment because, 2021, the end of the war in Afghanistan, it's obviously, like pretty tragic moment in lots of different ways, however, whatever way you look at it. And I think a public that is very much sick of long wars in one sense, right? It's very, very tired of the long wars and the war and terror and of endless military intervention overseas. Relatedly, we're seeing, obviously, we didn't talk about the all-volunteer force at all, but we're seeing a huge recruiting difficulties in the AVF that's been not seen since the late 1970s. So you get the sense that really that public facade of support for the military and for support for high military spending, you think, well, is it beginning to crack? You think of the various presidents, think of, say, presidents as different as Obama and Trump, both run on kind of, I won't say an anti-war platform, that's not at all accurate, but they sort of this thing that, well, I was against the Iraq war and I'm an outsider. So I think that's quite interesting. But then, as you rightly say, you then have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all of a sudden it's a very serious thing again. And I think there's another switch, and people quite rightly are supporting Ukraine against Russia. And yeah, will that scramble things up? Sorry, my thinking here is incoherent because I'm still thinking through this. But I think, so on the one hand, you've got declining public support for war. On the other hand, a very clear, visible threat from Russia, and of course, increasing tension with China. And in some ways, the beginnings of a new Cold War with China. And there's in some ways, you kind of wonder, will the old songs be sung again? I'm not sure that's necessarily a healthy thing. So yeah, look, as a historian, I have the great privilege of not making predictions. So I can just say,
Sorry to put you on the spot there with.
Oh, no, it's a very valid question. I think about it a lot. I'm not sure I've got good answers just yet. But all I can say is, hey, look at the 1940s, you might learn something there,
As we move toward creating so many agencies in the 1940s and 50s, were European and Eastern countries as well reacting as rapidly as the U.S. with the creation of all these new, ways to track and monitor and prepare for any sort of conflict?
No, that's a really good question. No, I'm an Americanist, so I can't give you a deep dive into thinking of Whitehall or the Elysee. But I will say the difference between the US and other countries in this time was, I mean, just at that moment, the sheer wealth of the US, the sheer state capacity they had to build these agencies in Europe and in Western Europe, Eastern Europe in the 1940s was not in a place where it was capable of sustaining military industrial complex at all. It was barely capable of restarting society. So to what extent leaders saw the Cold War threat as existential, I do think Americans, because the particular nature of American anti-communism, saw the threat as more existential than others did, certainly in Western Europe. They saw the threat, they reacted to the threat. I mean, NATO was, of course, the famous, you keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. That's the point of NATO. That's the European construction. But I don't think they're building out the national security state as rapidly, and I think that's a capacity issue. The Soviets are different in that they have a very robust national security state as it is, extremely robust one, as we're aware, in terms of its internal intelligence capabilities and its coordination. But that's a very different beast. It's a very different form of state, and of course, their capacity is, they're so focused at that point in time on rebuilding their capacity after the war that I don't think, for all their efforts at building up a nuclear arsenal and everything else, I think the US is relatively unique in not how big the state was. The Soviets had a bigger national security state, but how effective it was, just because the Americans could pay for it in ways that others couldn't before it at the time.
I think this is coming up on our last question here. Oh, no, sorry, one more after this. Did Truman make the statement that he regretted for calling it the creation of the CIA?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I would need to check on that. I do know Truman did regret, broadly speaking, I think that the beast he had created, but I won't kind of put myself, I mean, recorded, I won't put myself on record as giving a firm answer. I would have to check that out. It sounds consonant about what I know about his feelings about the national security state afterwards, but I'm not actually sure on the CIA point. So I have to plead ignorance about that and apologize for not giving a good answer.
No problem. And then here, this is the last question. I believe you mentioned Eisenhower's farewell speech that warned against the military and military industrial complex. Do you think his words are still heeded today?
No, the very short answer.
Very quick.
Very quick. No, but I didn't know. It's a great question. And so, look, I do think, you look at and Michael Brain's book here, which is brilliant. He talks about, like the inability of congressional representatives of all stripes to get off the military industrial complex in a way, and how difficult it is to extract yourself from that. Now, look, I think, that the Biden administration is not a particularly militarist administration, but there's a couple of things. One is the domestic political consequences for drawing down defense spending. I can give you, so this might be too long an answer, but I was just recently in Oakland. I was working in the papers of Ron Dellums, who was a chair of the House Armed Services Committee, militant anti-war activist, and chair of the House Armed Services Committee, opponent of the Pentagon, did not get on well with the military. Yet when it came to the end of the Cold War and they began closing down bases in the Bay Area, like Alameda Naval Station, Oakland Army Base, Dellums didn't want them to close them. Dellums was saying, like, look, we got to do something here. There's jobs in my district. So there's that. And then also what I would say about the last thing I will say is that national security provides a really tempting framework for politicians, a really tempting tool, because under national security, it is de facto an emergency. And under emergency, you can do things quickly. You can break through congressional log jams really quickly, right? So you think about the pandemic and you think about, for instance, Trump invoking the Defense Production Act, saying we need to, he didn't do a very good job invoking, frankly, but like we need to produce more masks, more cotton swabs, et cetera, et cetera. You think about Biden invoking the Defense Production Act to get the vaccines built out more quickly. Now, you can talk about COVID-19 being a national security threat, but the point here is it's very far away from what Truman would have thought about as a national security threat. And yet the term, when it's a security issue, it gets done and gets done quickly. And that, in this world of dysfunction and all that, that's a very tempting tool. And I think it's very hard for policymakers to put that down for sort of obvious reasons, I think.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Comparing the two distances in time and the processes of thought. Once you put it that way, yeah, it's easy to see how it is difficult to put that little piece down when it's such a valuable tool to use.
Absolutely.
Dr. Fitzgerald, thank you for joining us today. It was a pleasure speaking with you and listening to you talk about your work. I can't wait for the paperback to come out so I can pick it up at an affordable price. For those of you who joined us today, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you next time. You can always find all of our virtual events and our in-person events at wisvetsmuseum.com/event schedule. Like I said, we look forward to seeing everybody out at our next book talk. And once again, Dr. Fitzgerald, thank you so much for joining us. That was a fantastic presentation. I learned so much in that 45-minute span.